good news with others. Now be with us today. Give us open hearts, give us listening ears, and more importantly, put feet to action that we may be your presence in your world. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Dr. Bridgeman.
Trying to make sure my phone goes fine. Well, good morning, and thank you all for those of you who were able to return on Friday morning. A friend of mine said recently, it's always the second lecture that people can't be there, and I totally get that. I want to offer again my deep gratitude for the opportunity to do these lectures this year. It's history and tradition that you should be proud of. So I and I'm curious now to know how much money we actually raised last night, because I know I gave online, so I'm like, I think we did closer than 3,100 or whatever was announced last night. So, but thank you all for returning this morning. As I told you yesterday, I'm writing a commentary on Job, so I'm kind of living in the midst of Job in ways that most of you probably never do, and thinking a lot about the arguments therein. And because the Trout lectures are presumably about preaching, I had to think about, and I hope I demonstrated how to preach Job. So today's lecture, well, let me finish. Yesterday I tried to set the premise for relational engagement with the text as I described Job's ability to argue to God, if not with God. And I maintain that Job's kind of wisdom foregrounds the needs of people who are in relationship with the divine, and that arguing with God is, in fact, an act of faith, as a womanist. Such arguing was considered being audacious, grown folk business, courageous, and indeed willful. Such arguing with God or about God or at God, I know our arms are too short to box with God, but we can at least fuss, reminds us we are in a covenantal relationship that's not meant to be transactional. A stance I'm taking contraindicative to the Deuteronomistic history, which is definitely meant to be transactional. If you do this, then God will do that. I'm suggesting that the wisdom traditions of the Hebrew Bible offer us much insight in how we may be human in the presence of God who created us. And that in some ways our relationship with God is, though it's covenantal, it's a covenant that is based in creation. How can we be truthful about our beings, about our emotion, our feelings, our longings, and our needs? Ken Stone, in his commentary on Job in the Queer Bible commentary, notes that we've often misread Job because we've taken James 5:7-11 as a way for us to read it. So because we're Christian and we go to the Christian text before we read the Hebrew Bible, we read Job as a patient sufferer. But you don't have to read very far into Job before you know that Job is anything but patient. The story is dialogical and argumentative. As a noble, wealthy, pious man, Job is a model worshiper, not in any known region where ancient Israelites lived, but a sign of one whom God would consider righteous by Torah standards. So today's lecture, Arguing with God and Winning, a sermon full of questions and promises, returns to the book of Job as a paradigmatic example in the biblical text of how the ancient Israelites process their grief and trauma from captivity, and how this wisdom tradition of dialogue and argumentation offered them a different way of being in relationship with the deity. As I noted yesterday, Job is a novella, a traumatic novella that pushes the boundaries regarding theodicy, that theological question of where's God when it hurts, and why does bad things happen to good people? Now, as a theological category, theodicy presumes several underlying challenges for the faithful. According to Richard Swinburne, for example, in his chapter titled Theodicy in the Christian Tradition, in the book Providence and the Problem of Evil, there are various strands of theodicy in Christian tradition. One, that evil is simply the absence of good, or that evil was caused by the fall of Adam or of the angels, or that human free will requires the possibility of moral evil, and that evil is needed to promote the growth of souls. Now, for Swinburne, that first strand, that evil is just the absence of good, is worthless, he thinks. And the value of the second one is exaggerated, the fall of humans. But this other one about the role of the possibility of moral evil to promote growth, in the Jewish traditions and the rabbinic readings, it's the propensity or the inclination of evil would be the way it's put in the rabbinic tradition. So the book of Job, however, as Stone notes, probe these difficult matters as radical suffering, the nature of God, our motivation for piety, justice and retribution, chaos and creation, beauty and brutality, and the tension between our individual experiences and emotions on the one hand, and the rigid categories given to us by tradition and society on the other hand, the end of quote. Rather than offering us this, that's not the end of the quote. Rather than offering us a single perspective on such matters, the book of Job opens an argument and invites us to join. That's the end of the quote. Now, I agree with Stone that what Job gives us is a treatise on the messiness of life, of theological certainty, of what it means to be faithful. And since we continue to claim this book as a part of the canon, I'm going to keep saying that because we don't like to look at it that way, then we Christians, especially we Christian preachers, must contend with the questions and the arguments, no matter what text you are preaching from. Now, as the story goes, Job's suffering and trauma is in direct contact with other people's suffering, especially his wife, and becomes a theological challenge for his three friends, as you see in chapter 2, where they come, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come because they've heard of his troubles, and they go out, they meet with each other, decide they're going to go sympathize and comfort him. But as the scripture says in chapter 2:12, they saw him from a distance and they could hardly recognize him. And they began to weep aloud and tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. My aside to this piece from the text is, think about the times when you have been unrecognizable to yourself when you're suffering. Think about the times that you have said about people, you know, that's not who they are. They were not themselves. They were unrecognizable to us, right? Because suffering has that impact. And they did not say anything to him for 7 days and 7 nights, you know, a good length of time. Job's suffering made him hardly recognizable, and they sat with him, according to the story, because they saw how great his suffering was. Someone said to me yesterday, I'm sorry I didn't get the name, said to me, I wondered what would have happened had he had friends there to walk with him. Well, they were there. It's just that the discomfort of the length of the suffering got to them. We want things to be over really quickly. Let me give you an aside. When I won't call his name, shot up Mother Emmanuel at a Bible study and 9 people's lives were lost, that was like on a Tuesday. By Sunday, people wanted that whole community to be over it. They wanted people to have forgiven and moved on and as an act of faith show us. They didn't want to contend with the trauma that was visited on a whole community of people because they invited someone into Bible study. Here's my second aside. I was at the time attending a church that was integrated. I still attend a mostly white church now, but this was mostly black. And the second Sunday after the shooting, a white man came in to worship in a flap jacket. And you can imagine what we all were doing. We were not feeling like inviting him into the presence of God. Trauma, suffering, unrecognizability. Job is not passive, however, despite how we have read his words about the Lord giveth, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. We see his angst and anger beginning in chapter 2 with his very first soliloquy. He curses the day he was born. Much like Jeremiah in Jeremiah 20, when Jeremiah says, "It would have been better had I never been born." This level of depression and struggle often accompanies human suffering and trauma. When I worked many years ago in a land far, far away, in a trauma center and in a hospice center, whenever it was difficult to control pain, patients often moaned for an end of their life. Death would be better than life. I remember a particular patient early in the AIDS epidemic when the nurse called to say to me around 2 o'clock in the morning that she had a patient who was in pain, but the pain was not physical. It was in the era when the protocol was to mask, put on gloves, put on a gown, go in fully armed, because we didn't at that point really understand how the disease was spreaded. And we never touched patients. I went to his room and he was sobbing inconsolably. I decided when I saw him on his bed to break every protocol. I didn't mask and glove. I sat on his bed with him, which is a definite no-no. And I held him in my arms, which was also a definite no-no. He was dying from AIDS, and I held him, I am not exaggerating with this number, for 2 hours before he could speak. When he was able to speak, he told me that I was the first person to touch him skin to skin in 3 years. His lover had left him because he said, "I cannot watch another friend die from this disease." His father, who was a minister, had abandoned him and threatened his mother and siblings that if they remained connected to him, he would cut them off financially and otherwise. Abandoned, alone, bereft of touch and relationships, he wanted to die. As I have been working on the book of Job, I have thought of this young man often, because this is the level of angst and rage and suffering that people experience. He became and is, for me, a touchstone because he used much of the same language that Job used. This is why I'm suggesting you read the book of Job, because people use this language even if they've never read the book. Joel Wildermuth, if he's here, said to me yesterday that a rabbi told him that Ecclesiastes and Job is probably the most existentially honest book in the Bible. I think that's true. The questions are, where do I fit in God's creation? My existence is an existential crisis. If God does not help me, why? And what does it take to get God's attention for good? Where does it fit in my experiences if the heavens are silent and I cannot find God? These questions come up over and over for Job's friends and for Job. But rather than sit with the inscrutable nature of God, the friends begin to deflect. It must be Job's fault because God is righteous and good, etc. But Job finds no comfort in being blamed for his own condition. In fact, he argues in chapter 7, where I preached from last night, that I was at ease and God shattered me, seized me by the neck and scattered me, set me up as God's own target. Job feels cosmically besieged and threatened, maybe even paranoid. Let me hasten to say that I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I am merely a human who has suffered from loss and deep clinical depression. And I recognize these feelings that Job expresses. I also know that it never helped me for someone to start dismissing or diminishing my feelings. While feelings are not facts, they are real. I'll say that again. Feelings are not facts, but they are real. As preachers, carers of the soul, we are called to be present for and to acknowledge the realness of people's feelings and experiences of those with whom and for whom we minister. As I am arguing, it's a good grounding for preparing to preach. No matter what text you are preaching from. Another way of saying that is to quote one of my mentors, Dr. Dale Andrews, may he rest in peace. Dale would say, what is the pain in the room? What is the disappointment? What's the struggle in the room? Who's vulnerable and afraid? Who feels misunderstood, abandoned, or alone? What does the word you are about to preach say to them? Or what would you say in the face of Job's questions? Carol Newsom, in her commentary on Job, notes that one of the offers we receive from the book of Job is a critique of tradition in the face of experience, or an experience that is contrary to that tradition. Let me say, as a doctor of the church, as someone who values tradition, we are terrified of critiquing it. But it needs critiquing sometimes. It just does. We can talk about that later if you want to, but I'm just saying. We must also admit that the story of Job is a patriarchal one. In order for those receiving it, us hearing it, it has been that it had to be a man of wealth and reputation, somebody who, quote, didn't deserve to suffer. We have a list of people that we think are deserving of what happens to them, right? Another way of saying that is, what would we think if Job was a slob like one of us? Newsom notes that readers are accustomed to thinking of Job as a universal character, at least as an every man, if not an every woman. Of course, it's possible to gain insight, as I contend here we must. Among our questions must be the suspicion of why do we prefer the wealthy and the well-off, the so-called nobleman? Why are we willing to believe the worst of Job's partner, his wife, who either gave birth to or oversaw the birth of all his children. I'm allowing for some of these children to be the children of concubines. Or in my conversation last night with soon-to-be Dr. Dedra Avery, why are we not willing to see Job's wife as a wailing woman? These are her thoughts, not mine. A professional mourner in the ways that ancient Israelites might have seen her. We don't even posit the possibility. Trained as we are as theologians to speak a word about God, and like the people to whom we preach, if we are honest, to know what it feels like to say, my God, why have you abandoned me? The crux of the matter is that we are called to be human on behalf of the gospel we preach. That calls for asking difficult and pressing questions of God and of ourselves, even the questions for which we cannot get answers. But as Newsom points out, we also need to notice that what Job mourns is status. Job remembers most fondly the honor and the deference that he got from his peers. He is not mourning the life of his children, just what having children meant for his life. So the friends become equally important in the text because of this question of honor and shame in the ancient Israelite tradition. These, of course, are just some of the ways that feminist womanists problematize the questions that are raised in this book, and I would say that we are called to do. Stone in his chapter reminds us that taken as a whole, quote, taken as a whole, the book of Job ultimately refuses to be captured by a single, clear, consistent conclusion. It is not an orderly treatise, but rather a cacophonous argument, incorporating multiple points of view and conflicting positions. But how could it do justice to its topic otherwise if it were not this messy? What Stone is pointing toward, and what I am agreeing to, is life is messy, and we have gotten in the habit of cleaning it up in our preaching. I have not in this lecture talked about the vision of God that Job and his friends impose upon us in the book, but consider again what Newsom says when she says Job's categories of rights and wrongs and his conception of God as a larger version of himself are simply inadequate to encompass the vision God finally shows him in the speeches from the whirlwind. Most of us, many of us, often all of us, are guilty of making God just a bigger version of ourselves. But as Dr. Judith Fentress Williams reminds us, the dialogues of Job continue to call us to wrestle with our limitations to understand elements of our own existence, the existence of pain and suffering that we do not understand, and our misunderstood assumption, this is important, that if we understood why there was suffering, that we would be better able to bear it. The book of Job invites us to question our motivations, ours and those of others. It invites us to revisit what we really think of what it means to be pious, and what we believe ought to be the payoff of such piety. Job invites us to resist certainty, which I think is the opposition of faith, not doubt. For those of us who think we can surely know anything, there's a Church of God hymn that I am grounded in, which is, I know in whom I have believed. That's about all I can know. Because God cannot and refuses to be contained or explained by us, there is a mystery that is unsettling and maybe even unsatisfactory for us. And yet, the book of Job shows us the importance of our unanswerable questions, putting them out in the cosmos. To argue with God and to win is to become brave and audacious enough to keep the sermon full of questions, even the ones that leave us hanging with no answers, because that prospect is faithful to our lived experience. That is, to have questions to which we have no answers. Bishop Yvette Flunder, who lectured in this series before, often says, now that she's older, she gets the fewer answers she has. Now that the older she gets, the fewer answers she has, and the more she trusts God's presence. I have contended, and I will continue to believe, that arguing with God and throwing up questions are acts of faith. And as Fentress Williams concludes, in Job we discovered that as a part of the created order, our hope is in our relationship with God, unquote. And that is the win. Thank you. So apparently this lecture was supposed to be an hour long, but I was a newspaper person in another life too, and I believe in getting it said what I'm thinking. But that opens up the door for us to have a much longer conversation, and I'm willing to have that with you. So what have I said that provokes in you something else that we need to say more about? I just want to say again my shout out to Dedra for that conversation last night about whether or not Joe's wife might have been a professional wailing woman. That was good. It should show up in something you write. I just want you to know. Conversations, and there's a mic that's rolling. Raise your hand and the mic will get to you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you know where the origins of where we can't question God, where does that come from? Can you speak on that?
I kind of do. Be deeply careful of what you say now. A part of the lineage of the church has been, how do we who are in authority keep authority? Right. I say this as one with authority, so I'm just describing now. I'm not pointing fingers. And so, I mean, think about the times that when you were a child and you kept asking your mama a question and she ran out of answers and finally said, because I said so. Well, the church does it way more sophisticated than that. Really. I mean, in the vows we take when we are ordained, it is essentially a vow not to question what we have just agreed to. I'm not saying anything's wrong with that. I'm just saying that it's at the level of authority. Who gets the final say of things? And when I was growing up in a small Baptist church in the woods in Alabama, I had a Sunday school teacher who was very subversive. She would be very submissive and whatever out in public, but in the class with us, she would be saying, "Do you believe that? Do you actually believe that?" And it is her and my mom who taught me to ask questions. and to figure out that questions were not anathema to what it meant to be in relationship with God. But it is at the level of authority, I think, that we have been trained not to question God because we have the answers in our creeds. And when in doubt, quote a creed. Be real honest, generations behind us have no sense of the creeds in the way that we grew up with them, those of us who had creeds. I mean, I go to Baptist churches where I never hear the Baptist covenant, and I grew up where that's all you didn't do church without hearing the covenant. You didn't go to a church that was a creedal church without hearing a creed. That is not true anymore. So the creeds and the covenants are answers to any question you should have about God, and therefore, if you have a question, that's your source, right? Secondary to the Bible. Yeah, I don't know that actually answers your question, but that's my answer. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm thinking of the AIDS patient that you were talking about, and how so often when we are talking with people who have had tremendous trauma, how Job comes up. And I'm wondering, how do you respond to the question, how could God allow this?
Yeah. I typically don't. Partly because I'm trained as a chaplain, 4 units of CPE, and my answer is I don't know. And by the way, I think preachers need to learn this phrase. Say it with me. I don't know. You know, and saying I don't know, and then resisting the urge to say, but God is good. All the time, and all the time. You know, resisting the urge to feel the pathos with some word of certainty, even if we don't know. Even if we're saying, God, what the world? Ourselves, right? One of the things being a chaplain for the 8 years I was a chaplain did for me is to see people in some of the most horrific moments in their lives, right? And I don't have a theological answer for you. I might have a pastoral one, which is, I love you, and I love you in the name of God. And I'm going to be here with you, and I'm going to be here with you in the name of God. But I don't know that helps you as much as lets you know you're not alone, right? That's not a theological answer, right? So when people say, why did God let this happen to me? You know, yesterday I had an accident. I was like, really, God? On the way to talk about Job, this is where we are, right? You know, this is what Dr. Fentress Williams is talking about when she says there are unknowabilities, period. And what Job, I know chapter 42 is supposed to be a neat bow on it, but it's an unsatisfactory answer. It really is. That is a horrible way to end a story. As a writer, I'm going to say, I would not end that story that way. But for theological purposes and for certainty reasons and for let's not question God reasons, they needed the editors needed an answer. And like I said yesterday, theologies of replacements are not answers. Those new children in chapter 42 do not replace the children who are lost in chapter 1 and 2. They can't. It's not possible. So the best we can do is own what we don't know. This is the inscrutable nature of God. I can't believe I'm quoting Romans right now. but I am. And that those of us who maintain relationship with God in meditation and in prayer and in walking out our faith, we do so with a whole lot of uncertainty, if we're going to be honest, which is my point, right, in reading Job, that it is requiring of us who preach and us who pastor and us who teach a level of honesty about what we do not and cannot possibly know. It's requiring an honesty that we have not been trained in. We've got to retrain ourselves to that kind of honesty.
In addition to the I don't know, the late, great Reverend Dr. Tim Huffman, professor here at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, said, the best answer to give folk at those questions is, I'm not on that committee.
I'm not on that committee?
I'm not on that committee.
All right.
A lot of times we like to make those decisions for God, and it's not our place.
Yeah.
And so I don't know is great, but we ain't in charge of that, so right. I'm not on that committee.
Yeah. I mean, this is why Job arguing with God is so important to me. That we have this record of this poetry of arguing with God. You know, when Job says, I go forward, I cannot perceive you. I go backwards, I cannot comprehend you. To the left or to the right, I don't know where you are. And then, of course, Job says, but you know the way I take, which is a theological statement, right? I mentioned there's a question here, here, and here, I know. I mentioned when COVID started, I started walking every day. If you were not out, you probably missed that the animals came out during COVID. Like they were everywhere. They were like, oh God, thank you, the humans are gone. They were everywhere. I mean, I saw bald eagles. And I'd have to go with binoculars, but like literally landing in streets. And I was like, what the world? And fox and hedgehogs and all of creation groaning with us, responding to whatever was going on in the world, right? Again, why I think reading Job is important, because God's answers back to Job has to do with the world is bigger than you. There's more going on than what's going on with you, which is not the same thing as me minimizing what's happening to you. It is asking us to get a perspective as well. This is not saying, well, other people got it worse than me. No, your pain, your suffering matters. But it is in concert with a suffering world. It really is. And so that's a part, I think, as I'm working on Job, a part of what I think I'm going to say is that part of the challenge here is we are so anthropocentric, so human-centered, that what's happening in Gaza is horrific. But what's happening in Gaza is not just happening to the people. It's destroying whole swaths of the earth as well. It's horrific. It's horrific. That's all I want to say. I don't know whose hand was up. Okay, whoever had that mic back there, pass it forward. And who's the person with the mic over here? Go for it. Whoever gets the mic first.
All right. I just want to know what you mean by question, and what is a question, and how do you know it's a question?
What's a question, and how do you know it's a question? Yeah, good. I'm going to have to answer that for this commentary, am I not? Right? Yeah, so interrogative is not a statement, right? It's not a railing. It's literally a I want to know statement, right? How can I know? Will you help me understand? That kind of question. So if you say what time it is, that's a I want to know, right? If you say, how do you make that lemon cake that we had yesterday? I want a recipe, right? So it is the statement that is looking for more information. Although I'm going to agree with Dr. Fentress Williams that it is also sometimes the mistaken notion that if we have more information, we could do better with it, right? And when I was married for 29 years. My husband made red beans and rice, and they were slamming. And one day he asked me, do you want me to teach you how to make red beans and rice? Question. Answer, no, because then I'll have to make them. I want yours, right? So this notion of getting information that will advance the relationship or advance, because pressing on to know, to quote Hosea, assumes that you are asking questions to get knowledge, and knowledge that will get you to wisdom, right? Because knowing something doesn't necessarily mean you are wise. A child may know they shouldn't break their parents' rules and do certain things, but that doesn't stop them from doing it. I am reminded that my sister's son one time, she said to him, I would think you would eventually learn, because when friends do things, you're the only one that ever gets caught.
Yes. I have a child like that.
So knowing isn't necessarily the same thing as wisdom, right? But questions, the interrogative portion of that, of trying to get the information, gives us data with which to work. I don't know that answered your question, but it's going to now become a part of the commentary. Thank you. No, really, I thank you for that. Somebody back here. Yes.
Doctor, I don't.
Could you stand up?
Okay. I don't even know how to frame this question, and I'm going to have to put a lot of commentary on it to make it make sense. But I have just started down the womanist track. So I took a course with Dr. Trout and others, and listened to the Womanist Bible podcast. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I feel like I'm in seminary, first year. My theology is being dismantled. Mm-hmm. And I just recently heard a podcast on Womanist Talk, Bible Talk, that talked about Job and talked about God as working, God is acting as intimate partner violence.
Do you remember what podcast that was?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember the podcast?
Yes, I have it on my phone, I can tell you.
Okay, I'll get it from you afterwards.
Okay, yes, and it was Marlene Underwood who did it. There's a book. It's in the book.
Yeah, that's at the level of her work, so I would imagine that she would do that.
So I mean, I've listened to that a couple of times, and I'm just blown away, because what it says to me, if I believe her premise, then what that says to me is that God is not good all the time, and all the time God is not good.
Right. So what it actually says, I'm formulating a question, which is, when we do a hermeneutic that asks us to ask audacious questions, what then do we do with the God we discover? Right. So Renita Weems, biblical scholar, often says, I'm not telling you what God said, I'm telling you what the Israelites say God said. What I would say is we are trafficking in texts that we are not, these texts have a life of their own. They have come down to us through generations. And so when we stand, I know we stand liturgically and say, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. I do it, so I'm not arguing with our liturgics here. But as a biblical scholar, I am saying that we have to be honest about the God we discover when we start digging. And then we have to ask ourselves, is that the God we know? Which I think is what Underwood would say. I know that's what most womanist scholars would say, but is that the God you know? And this is what I was trying to get at when I said Newsom talks about the difference, Ken Stone talks about the difference between the God of our experience and the God of our traditions, right? And what are we to do with that? It requires a kind of bravery and audaciousness that most of us don't have, right? I'm often called a heretic, and then people say, but you love Jesus. I don't understand. Like, it's because I've gotten comfortable with the questions. I understand that the God of my experience can take my questions, right? I can take my questions. Now, to the question about whether or not in Job this is intimate partner violence. Well, Job talks about it like it is. That's chapter 7, that whole thing about, listen, you uncover me. It's the same thing Jeremiah does in Jeremiah 20. And it's certainly what Hosea does, right? Talks about God as a violent man. And this, again, is where Newsom is instructive, where she says that Job has constructed in the argument a God that just is a bigger him. So what you hear Job saying is, I wouldn't do this if I were God. And be clear, I say that to God all the time. Like, if I were you, this ain't how this would go down. I told y'all I had a hit list. It's like, if I were you, this is not how this would go. So part of what you are encountering in the text, I think womanists and feminists might argue, certainly I would argue this, I won't speak for anybody else, is the construction of God as they understood. And that God, the God of their understanding is in a milieu of ancient Near Eastern, ancient Afro-Asiatic world, right? It's not just they're thinking independent of the people around them, right? It's like, well, how do you, it's almost as, I don't want to call this ridiculous, even though that's the word I'm thinking. A full lunar eclipse happens somewhere every 18 months. Only in the U.S. does it become an apocalyptic event. Every time. So, and God is speaking, right? So part of the challenge as you are being dismantled, I'll tell you what I say to my students: hold to what you believe right now, carefully but loosely, so that if God takes it out of your hand, you won't lose a finger trying to hold on to it. The other thing I would say about this intimate partner violence language, Renita Weems in her book, Battered Love, which she wrote in 1993, 94, she points out, and this is what I'm trying to get at, that the language that is used in the text is language that men would have understood, because it's written for a public that is not women. And battering a wife, beating your lover, you made me do this, is intimate violence. See what you made me do? Which is what Hosea says, that God says. See what you made me do? And all of us ought to recoil from that. That should never be an answer. I want to say, as a poet friend of mine said, just walk away. I know that's not how that works, because the moment somebody walks away is the most dangerous point for the person leaving. They are most in danger when they decide to leave, right? So the fact that, at least at the level of the text, that Job keeps arguing tells me that at the level of the text does not feel threatened of being annihilated by God, right? Because if anybody's ever been abused, you know you do not keep talking to your abuser. Not if you want to live or not have a black eye. So at the level of the text, I can see that. Yeah. There was another question and I lost it. There it is. Go.
Dr. Bridgeman, this is mostly just appreciation for what you did. I have 2 pages of notes, and the notes just keep getting smaller and smaller, because I realized if I kept writing big, it'd be 8 pages of notes. So just really appreciate what you did here. And I just want to lift up one of the first things I heard you say and one of the last things that I heard you say. One of the first things I heard you say was the theological questions in the book of Job are disarming. And what I think is so appropriate and beautiful about that is that when you are disarmed, you are vulnerable. And so the experience of reading the book of Job transmutes us into the lived experience of Job, that vulnerability, that kind of fearfulness. I also think it's really interesting that if you are disarmed, you have your weapons taken away from you. So, how many of us have questions and anger at God that we turn to weapons at other people or at ourselves? So that this process of reading the book of Job might actually take our weapons away from us and put us in a relationship from which we can move away from those weapons.
So say your name so I can quote you.
Rachel
in the
Wren.
So I can quote you in the book, Rachel.
Rachel Wren.
Yeah, I'm seriously working on this commentary.
If you quote me in your book, my work here is done, friends. But the second thing, and I was writing one of the things you just said a little while ago.
And Rachel, I would have known that was you, but I don't have on my glasses,
That's
and I
all
cannot
right.
see you that far back. Anyway, go ahead.
I'm sitting in the shade of your presence, so I don't mind not being recognized. One of the last things you said, and I was taking notes, so I don't know if I heard you correctly, but even if you didn't say this, you should put it in your book as well.
Okay.
But
y'all are helping me write a commentary.
Right.
Have y'all figured that out yet?
It's a village. It takes a village. No, but I think you said the gospel of Job keeps us faithful to our lived experience.
Yes, I did say that.
Okay, so that's all I need to say is what you said.
I did say that. Well, thank you. Yes, I like that notion of vulnerability disarming us. And let's be real clear that only some of us can feel safe enough to be disarmed, right? There are multitudes of communities that don't feel like that they can put their weapons down, rhetorically or otherwise, right? And I wonder, and this is really a question, I wonder what our role is as church, as the community of faith, in helping create spaces where lions and lambs literally can lay down together, right? Yes. Somebody with the hand. Okay, go and bring this other mic here and go for it.
Hi. I've been thinking about that replacement theory, and wasn't Job and his wife kind of old?
Were they old?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I'm impressed that when I see grandparents with grandchildren, the common statement that is said, no wonder the children are given to the young, because the grandparents are tired.
Right.
And so I'm wondering what the energy level of Job and his wife are to raise this replacement family.
Right.
You know, that not only does it not fill the gap, but it takes another load of energy.
Yeah. Well, I would have to do some midrash on that because the text itself does not say anything about the age of Job and his wife. So if they were, I mean, he's a wealthy man, but it doesn't say he's an old man.
Right.
And I wouldn't make the assumption that to be wealthy is to be old, because he could have inherited that wealth from a father.
But even when kids start young, and I know in the Hebrew scriptures they started younger than we typically do.
Yeah, like 12 and 13.
Right. You're still older than you were.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it just kind of, not only is it not, it just doesn't work to have a replacement family, and yet it's like, well, everything's fine. He got a new house. He got a new family. And let us rejoice. And it just doesn't seem like justice.
Right.
And
that would be, I think that would be Stone's argument, that if we are seeing chapter 42 as all is right with the world again, as a justice move, that's a misreading of that text. And I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet, because I don't like chapter 42, you probably figured out. But the notion that, I mean, it is a biblical answer. And as woman scholar Will Gaffney would say, a biblical answer doesn't necessarily mean a godly answer. It just means it's in the Bible, right? I mean,
right.
Those aren't the same thing in and of themselves. Right. So I hear you. Yeah. I just don't think.
And when I've talked to wise people who have lived a difficult and challenging life, if you ask them, would you like to do it all over again? And the first thing they say is, heavenly days, no. And is Job being asked to live his life over again?
Right.
What would he do different? And I also like the thought that the parents that raise children who can talk honestly with them about anything are stellar parents. And I think that's a great preaching aspect for us to consider, that if we have the ability to ask God anything and not fear his wrath, can we help our parents to understand that same kind of ethos?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. Because I'm not thinking particularly about the deity in Job in the parental role. Right. Because Job is not thinking about the deity as a parent, but rather as a redeemer, as one who saves, one who provides, but not as a parent. Now, God in Job in the novella is not parent. Although I'm not saying you can't make that move. I'm not saying that's not a move you can make. Right. That is something you can learn about what does it mean to ask these kinds of questions, right? Or to be in relationship with somebody that you can ask them or say anything to them. But of the many pictures of God in the book of Job, I don't see parent as one of them.
Right. And nor does he state that, but I've noticed parental relationships with children is, I think there's a strength there.
No, I hear you. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, there was right here, and then there's a hand over here. Bring the mic. So, yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend who was going through a period of deep suffering, panic, depression, really depressed. And I was urging her to come back to the church, which would be a safe haven for her. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm just directing him to where the next question's coming from.
Okay.
Okay. So you were inviting her back to church.
Right. And then she said, why church? Why church? She said, they will just direct me to tell me the story of Job and his suffering. Why church? And I couldn't answer the question, why church?
Right.
So how do you direct people who are suffering, going through pain, given how the chapter or the book of Job will be presented to them in terms of the suffering, God, whatnot? What do they come away with?
Right. So thank you for that question. I think what your friend may be pointing to is that people use Job as a paradigm of patience. And they just look at the first 3 chapters of Job. And Job was just loving on God and all of that. They don't actually point people to Job. Because Job is cantankerous in the book of Job. What I am suggesting is that the church really get to know Job. Like, really get to know Job and the questions that are unanswerable there. And my answer would be, go to a church where people are comfortable with your questions. Now, I don't know if there's such a church. I mean, I think the church where I worship is that. But this is what I'm challenging us as church folk to become, the kind of place where we aren't fix-it folks, where we're trying to fix people's whatever, even with the book of Job, but really to invite people into these questions and railings and to scream with them if you need to. This is a true story. A friend of mine was so mad one time with God, and she said, I just want to scream. I said, hey, I have an idea. I'm coming to get you. So I go over, I get her, I take her in the car, and we go. I said, I want to go hiking. She's like, what? I was like, put your boots on, let's go. So we go out in deep woods, and I said, let's just scream at God. She was like, have you lost your mind? I said, yeah, let's just scream at God. And for an hour, we lost our voice screaming at God. About 30 minutes in, she started cussing at God. And I said, go for it. Because here's the thing. If God is as dangerous to us as we say, why not be out in the woods where you can be struck by lightning? Nothing happened except she got it off her chest. This is crass, but I say this to my students all the time. It is crass. I know it's crass. But I say to my students all the time, God got broad shoulders, big tits. Can take it. Can take it. We're the ones who can't take it, but God can take it. So that would be my answer, which is go someplace where yelling at God is a faithful act. And I am challenging you who lead churches to make your church such a place.
Well, that was my question.
Even if that means building a padded room where people just throw stuff up against the wall. I am serious. I know all that sounds crazy, but helping people to be honest in the presence of a God we say that loves them is our work. This is our faithful work from my perspective. I hope that helped. I know it sounded silly, but I hope that helped. There was a question over here. Go for it.
Trying to recontextualize my question now with that answer.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm trying to recontextualize my question now with that answer.
Would you stand, please?
Yes.
I don't know why I can't hear you if I can't see you, but...
It's because I have a trouble talking loudly. Listening to that answer with a couple other questions that have been presented, it seems to me that you would write chapter 42 differently, right?
Yes.
So we've touched on the paternalism that's in the text. You even use paternal metaphors in your lecture. And Carol Newsom pointed out the patriarchy that's involved in the text. That this is ways that men have understood God, right? If we're reading this as an abusive relationship, a domestically abusive relationship, a paternally abusive relationship. How would we write chapter 42 differently for the people that can't go back to church?
Right.
Or for the people that are screaming at God? Because like the screaming that you're talking about it has an experience of God that's not represented in the text. So are you preaching against the text, or?
It's so, to you, first of all, I disagree that it's not in the text. I actually think Job and Habakkuk and a couple other places in the biblical text are exactly people screaming at God. I actually do think it's in the text. I think we avoid these texts because they are uncomfortable for us. I haven't figured out, however, how I'm going to rewrite chapter 42 in the commentary. I'm picking at it because of the pain that's in the pathos that's in the novella of Job. And right now I'm just that this is an unsatisfactory answer. This doesn't work for me. But I don't know yet what will work for me. I'm still writing. Maybe in 6 months when I get to the end, I'm going to remember that you asked me that question, and I'm going to say, tell me your name, first name. And I'm going to say, Naomi's question makes me rewrite chapter 42 like this, right? So I haven't done that. But to your point about, I don't know that I'm agreeing with Underwood, though I can see why she would say this, that this is intimate partner violence. I don't know that I would agree with that. The way the novella is set up, it's a bet, and that's problematic. It's a bet between God and an adversary, and Hasatan is not the same thing as the devil as we have come to understand Satan, right? That's not what that figure is in the book. And so I'm going to have to spend some time on the way that we have done, hang on, let me finish, have done that. But what I think is, because you're asking me about preaching against the text, I'm also saying preach beyond the text, which is to bring people's experiences, here now experiences, into the dialogue with the text. And there are sometimes, I'm going to quote myself now, when you have to say no to a particular text or no to a prophet, or you have to say, and this is what Stone was trying to get at, these multiple visions of God, I'm settling on this one because that's not the God I know. You're not going to make me know that God. But this requires the church to be comfortable with diversity and multiplicity and multivalence and multivocalness. This requires the church to believe that the sound of God is the sound of many waters, is a waterfall, is more than just a drop, right? That we don't know enough about God to say one thing about God and dare anybody else to say anything else about God. So that would be, you had more to say. I wanted to finish saying, Naomi, did you have more to say behind that? Yeah, go.
Thinking about like the ways that we think about intimate partners now, and then reflecting back like 2,000 years ago, like those constructions are different. So like a partner betting on you and like as a possession, actually like you could make the connections there, I think. Also, as you said, preaching beyond the text, like maybe you could look into like how people who have survived partners who have abused them and have been told by their partners, stop asking questions, like we're told in chapter 42. Right. Like how do they recover? Because I think that's actually the God that we desire, which isn't there in the text. So maybe that's how we push beyond.
Right. Well, you giving me some, as I said, y'all are helping me write this commentary. you're giving me something else to think about with regard to this interaction, because Job is not actually interacting with God and Hasatan. We know that because it's a, quote, backstory. And the question is, do we believe that backstory? Or if the editors have set us up for this story so that we can always say, and this is my question, so that we can always say, oh, Job is going to be okay because we know what happened. We actually know what happened. But that foreknowledge is not actually true. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll think about that. That's a good question. Yes, I can't see, I don't know where people are. Stand up if you got the mic. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Pastor Doug. I serve Divinity Lutheran in Parma Heights, which is just south of Cleveland. Mm-hmm. I want to thank you for your wisdom these last couple of days. I have to confess, I've been in and out. I've been writing a funeral sermon in my head while you've been speaking. The context, the story, we have a young couple who haven't joined the church. They have a 5-year-old son, 4-year-old daughter, who we have baptized at Divinity. And she had to get an abortion a few months ago because the pregnancy was endangering her life. On Wednesday afternoon, 3 days ago, she wasn't home from work yet. Her husband was with the kids at home, and he went in the house. They were in the garage. The 3-year-old boy, Max, was able to get his loaded handgun off the shelf and shot himself in the stomach. They life flighted him to Cleveland. He died during surgery. And the mom, for her, I represent God, I represent the church. She told her best friend who was with her that she'll be ready to talk to me. In a few days, she'll call me. But I know, they're on the edge of the church, like a lot of the millennials are nowadays. And it was important to have their children baptized. Now I'm going to be doing a funeral for a 3-year-old. And there's a lot of anger at God, a lot of anger at me, a lot of anger toward the husband. Why was that loaded gun where the little boy could get it? There's just so much going on. So I want to thank you. You've strengthened me for preparing that sermon this week. Thanks.
God bless you, Pastor. That's a very difficult situation that you are attending to. And I will certainly keep you in my prayers as you do so. It makes me go back to this question from Naomi about people who are on the edges of the church or don't want to come back to church, or why church, to that question. I shouldn't say this because I pastored for 27 years, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think Phyllis Tickle is right that we are in a major shift for the church, and maybe people, quote, coming to the church isn't even the point right now. It is the church being present for people. And what I heard from you is they were ready for you to be present with them. And they still are, even in their anger. So there's no need to tap down the rage, the fear, the sorrow, the anger, because they invited you into it. I'll be praying for you. Yeah. Before you ask your question, sir, that story reminded me of Naomi's question, and also this question about, I don't remember your name. Dolores. Question about why church. That question is the question to all of us who are professional churchgoers. Oh, really? Why church? Why do we think it's important what we are doing? Now, you may think that has nothing to do with Job, but I think Job's friends come in the name of the tradition, right? So why? Why is that necessary? When I was a hospice chaplain, I had a young man. He was queer. He said, I don't want to hear any Bible. He told them he didn't want a chaplain. And I was assigned this chaplain. And I was like, the man said he doesn't want a chaplain. It's like, leave people alone who say they don't want you. But right before he was dying, his partner came to my office and said, we need you. We need you to come into that room. I said, he doesn't want a chaplain. He said, I need you. What am I pointing to? I'm pointing to people know when they need something beyond themselves, and it may not be our tradition, but it may be our loving care that comes out of our tradition, right? When I did slam poetry in Austin, we used to do it at Egos. Egos is the name of the club. And I was the pastor of a church, and I would tell my people, you can go to Egos with me, but you can't wear nothing that says, I'm a Christian. No, I don't want to see no crosses around your neck, no Bibles in your hand. None of that. If they can't figure out you love Jesus without all that, then go do something else. Go pray. But Egos on Wednesday night, which was Bible study night, had 200 people in there. Every Wednesday night for slam poetry. And I hosted. And I would be the host. And somebody would always say to me, there's something about you. And I would resist saying, well, you know, I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher. But eventually the word got out that I was. So I had to start drinking a beer so that people would know it was all right for them to drink a beer. I can say that to the Lutherans, can't I? All my Church of God friends just clutched their pearls. But my point here is I would end up in conversations with people at Egos that I could never have had with them if I were not sitting in that bar doing poetry with them. So maybe the call of God for us, our church had a place, we had a ministry called WIT, whatever it takes. WIT, whatever it takes. People would go play basketball the kids would go play basketball. People would go to poetry. People would go clean up. Whatever. People thought we were a huge church. We had 140 people max at that point. But we just made ourselves available as the presence of God in the world. Not to preach the gospel, but to be it. You, sir.
Oh, my turn?
Your turn.
Okay. God bless you, Chuck, and may God give you the strength as you navigate through all of that.
Indeed.
I'm Dr. Taylor. I'm just a poor, humble parish priest, retired. But I want to speak to depression in the church. When I was suffering with chronic pain syndrome, I was very depressed. Mm-hmm. And my siblings in the church said that my depression was a lack of faith.
Lack of faith, yes.
And I told them, no, it's not a lack of faith. For me, it's a lack of patience because I know God's going to deliver me. I'm trying to sync my Apple Watch with God's eternity watch on when are you going to do this? God, is your timing right now? That's what my depression was. It gave me the strength and the faith to ask the question, if you're always on time, is now the time?
Right. What you are pointing to, thank you so much for sharing, is that our theological cliches often don't work. He may not come when you want him, but he's always right on time. Those of us who suffer from hidden diagnoses, I have an autoimmune disease, and chronic pain is my portion. along with some other diseases, those of us who live with hidden diseases often are sitting listening to people make these theological claims that don't align with the experiences they're having. So as a pastor, I would say part of our work is also to get to know. It's kind of what Tisdale used to call local theology. Get to know the folk you know, to whom you are called to be in relationship with. I often say about depression and anxiety, take your blue pill while you're praying. Speaking to myself. We tell people to take their medicine for diabetes, and we don't think that's a lack of faith. But we treat diseases of the mental brain, of the heart, as if that somehow is a lack of faith. No, these are episodic. Sometimes they're chronic. Sometimes they are because of something very specifically that happened. Sometimes they are chemical. In any event, as a pastor, as the one who preaches, back to what Dr. Andrew says, everybody's in the room, including Naomi, the abuser. They in the pews too. And so we have to think about how we are addressing people. Let me tell you one other story, and then I think I'm beyond my time. I was preaching in Nashville. I was invited to preach at Gordon Memorial United Methodist Church. And when I got there, the pastor said, I want to tell you about this congregation. I said, please don't. I said, don't tell me anything until after worship. I knew what I was going to preach. It was the lectionary text. And the lectionary text was the text where Jesus says, if you sin against somebody, you take one with you, and then, if they repent, forgive them, and then you take it to the church, and then you treat them as a publican and sinner if they don't. Now, we use that as church discipline. Kick them out. We're trying to figure out what's the best route to kick somebody out, right? But I preached this woman this sermon where I said, what if the person who has harmed you is a person in authority that you can't find your way to, and nobody will believe you to go with you? What if? And I'm a questioner. I asked these very hard questions of this text. There were over 300 people in the room, and the room was quiet. I was preaching, and the room was quiet. And I was like, dear Jesus. And people, but I've written it, and I know this is what God told me to say this morning. Now, I'm a preacher. I don't always know that what I'm saying is what I'm supposed to be saying right now. Y'all know if you preach, sometimes you just preaching. But this particular, because, you got to preach. Because Sunday comes every 7 days. And then you're saying the theologically correct thing, but not necessarily feeling, oh no, this right here is a word from God. I was like, oh no, this right here. Down the center aisle, there was a young woman who was weeping, and the people around her had their heads hung. They were just, and when I finished preaching, the associate pastor got up and said, church, we need to repent. I never seen people go to the altar like this. And I grew up in a holiness church, so I was like, what the world? I still don't know what's going on. I just know that I preached. Turns out that the young woman had been abused by a former pastor of the congregation, and the church turned on her because he was beloved, and they said, you made us lose our pastor. And she refused to leave the church because her family was a fourth-generation member of the church, and she said, I am not leaving. And they treated her like crap. I wanted to say the other word, but use your imagination. I didn't know any of that story when I was preaching, when they came to the altar. When afterwards she walked down that aisle and said, "Thank you for telling my story." And I said to them, I promise you, the pastor told me nothing about this church. It's my commitment to honest questions that broke this open. I'm suggesting to you that if there's going to be some healing, we have got to get committed to honest questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bridgeman. Whew. We have been challenged today. I know I have been challenged as to how we present God's word to God's people. Thank you very much. We will now have words of welcome from April Navanti, Capital University Vice President of Advancement. I guess we're not. Okay, we'll move right along to our next event. I would like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Kevin Dudley, moderator, and we're going to have some student panelists. I'm going to say who they are, and then I know we need some time to set up some chairs. We will be hearing today from Timothy Jordan, Seven O'Riordan, Malik Crosswhite, Julius Lancaster, and Carla Dowling Fitzpatrick. So we're going to get ready for that panel. So we'll have a few minutes for them to do that.